from our very own FOFA gallery downstairs. They're currently working on writing a meaningful and coherent curatorial statement. Her curatorial practice mainly highlights her research interests. She asks how to write a proper curatorial statement. What are the difficulties of doing so? What are the relevant questions she should ask herself while thinking about this endeavor? Ms. Belidor, during this performative talk, Ms. Belidor will attempt to answer these questions by going over her research interests and some exhibitions she has done in the past. Public participation is highly encouraged.
It is.
And next I have the pleasure to introduce to everyone. I think I'm going to wait till after the sirens. Just so I can make sure everyone hears. Okay. So Sandra Brewster is a visual artist based in Toronto. She has been recognized for her community-based practice that centers a Black presence located in Canada. The daughter of Guyanese-born parents, she is especially attuned to the experiences of people of Caribbean heritage and their ongoing relationships with their home. Brewster will speak about her thesis exhibition, Traces, Evidence of Time Past, that was exhibited at the Art Museum, University of Toronto. In Traces, metaphor, materiality, and storytelling are used to reflect on the transition of home, using her family's migration from Guyana to Toronto as inspiration. Brewster's work has been featured in solo exhibitions, including the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Art Gallery of Guelph, the Gallery in Vancouver, the YYZ Artist Outlet in Toronto, and A Space Gallery in Toronto. This also includes group exhibitions, including the Musica Gallery, Novi Sad, Serbia, Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, Arsenal, Havana in Cuba, Dunlop Art Festival in Regina. Would you like me to keep on going? No. So, as you can see, they're very acclaimed artists. They are currently artist in residence at the... in 2018?
Yep.
Okay. An artist in residence at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Brewster holds a Master of Visual Studies from the University of Toronto and a BFA from the York University. She is represented by the Georgia Sherman projects. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing about your practices.
Thank you. I guess I'll just go. Okay, so I just have to thank everybody for being here. Thank you, CUJAH, for inviting me. Thank you, Vanya, for corresponding with me. I really appreciate it. So I was asked to talk about trace, evidence of time past. You know, when I look at this, when I see evidence of time past, I actually remember this is the wrong name. It should be existence of time past. It was a show that I did during my time at U of T. It was my thesis exhibition, and for some reason there was some mistake with the naming of it. I think it was my fault, and then I always forget. I always go back to evidence. I'm like, no, it wasn't. It was existence. So the exhibition was called A Trace, Existence of Time Past, and I need to be in control. Oh my gosh, right in front of me. Okay. So this exhibition consisted of a series. So what I was doing here was I was talking about using metaphor and the material of photo-based gel transfers. The movement of my parents, my family, from Guyana to Toronto. So I'll just tell you about the photo-based gel process if people do not know about it. What I do is I take images of objects or people, I print them off using a laser printer. I use a gel medium that I cover the image with. I cover the surface that I'm working on. I put it together face to face. I wait for it to dry, then I wash off the paper and the ink is left behind. So within that process, there's a change that occurs, right? Because I have a certain amount of control over the process. Sometimes the ink does not adhere to the surface. Sometimes there's creases and folds. And so it really adds to the interpretive possibilities of the image, the resultant image. These images are of the Essequibo River, which is located in Guyana. It's a very long river that's also connected to the Demerara River, which is the stream of water that is known that was part of the transatlantic slave trade. I like this idea of using water and the river that I've always heard about a lot through my family as this metaphor for movement, right? The fluidity of water, as well as in some of the pieces, there is brown in the background. There's a wash of brown, which is to refer to the tannins from the leaves that fall into the water, as well as the silt and the sediment that's moving underneath. So it causes the water to become brown. It's clean water, but it's just stained from the tannins. So these are just close-ups of the shell transfers. These are also transferred on mylar, frosted mylar, so it has like a translucency to it. And it's lightweight enough so that when people walk past it, there's like a subtle movement that happens in the space. This is just another example of how they've been installed at Mercer Gallery. The jar in the front, that's a jar containing the mixture for black cake. So black cake is a cake that is made in many parts of English Caribbean. And it's, some people call it a colonial cake, which I hate that name, but I guess that's what it is. As it derives from British black pudding, right? So in the jar, there are currants and fruits that are being soaked in rum. And this cake is made in different parts of the Caribbean, and many times you'll have like a Guyanese person saying that they make better cake than the Trinidadian person. And so during my exhibition, what I had wanted to do was create this kind of, this community gathering, which I knew this would happen. So many people started to surround it, was peering in, wondering what was in there. And people who knew what was in there were able to find this strength and, oh yeah, I know what's in there. And then the competition occurs and teaching occurs. This piece I also called Heirloom because of that reason too. It brings all of these people together despite the how it's derived, right? And also because I'm putting it on a plinth and I'm putting it in this space, this institutional space where we would not normally find such stories. It's like a certain community is in on a secret that the institutions themselves are not in on. In the background is a transfer on the wall of my aunts in the Caribbean, on some mountain in the Caribbean. So I transferred them on the surface of the institution for that reason as well, because now they will be embedded into the architecture of the space. This is just a close-up of Heirloom. This is not a great picture, but in the background there is a window. It's it's an image of a window in a light box. And this is the actual image. I'll just show you that because it pains me when I look at that other picture. So while I was doing an internship in Chicago, I was staying in a house on Dorchester Avenue, and I was doing an internship with this artist who lives in that area. And I was peering through the window and thought that the scene was so beautiful, and so I had taken a picture of the image. And later on, I used to work by this window, but I would hear these sounds coming in from the window, and I used to think, it's fireworks because we're close to July 4th and such. But then when I started to look into the news, I realized that there was gunshots happening. This is an area that there was a lot of gun violence that was happening in that area, just west of me. So I started to relate this image to images like, Lorna Simpson has this piece called The Park, where she would take images from above of Central Park. And it's beautiful on the surface, but then there's all of these things that are happening beneath. And so this was, when I had taken this picture, it kind of reminded me of Lorna's Park. So yeah, just this idea of when you look at things on the surface, there can be such beauty, but you do not know what's happening beyond that. These are the members of the Senior Guyanese Friendship Association. When my mom first came to Toronto, she and her friends, they had wanted to put together an organization that will bring together their parents, right? That older community who were here, but who were not, they weren't even aware that each other were there because they all came for all sorts of reasons. And so these are the committee members. So these are the people who organize that organization. And so they're reading my thesis paper, and my thesis paper as part of the exhibition was a series of reflections that are retold by me, reflections of my parents that are retold, or my reflections on being a young person of Guyanese descent, but who was born here, but still has this grasp on this back home that I had never experienced before. At the end of the exhibition, in order to so-called remove the transfer on the back wall, what happens is the installers come in, they start to sand down the surface, and then they paint over the work. And so in watching them do this process, I just thought about how, and also, oh my gosh, in addition to this, with the my contact at the gallery at the Art Museum, she had continued to talk to me about the removal of this piece. And I would always respond, you don't have to remove the piece, you just have to sand it down and paint it over. And the next email again would be, she talking to me about removing the piece. It's like she didn't understand, you just had to paint it over. The piece is left there, you don't have to remove it. So for me, like it was just kind of this, mischievous enjoyment I was having over this dialogue between her. She wanting to remove these people, and I'm like, you don't have to remove them, they can stay right there. So anyway, so it started to relate to, legacy and permanence and archive, and so I ended up documenting these folks sanding down and painting over the image. What was wonderful is that when we had arrived to take recording of it, they had already put these beautiful lights. They had these beautiful floodlights that were peering onto the wall, and it was just gorgeous. And so we had taken, it was more gorgeous than this what I'm seeing here, but anyway. And so I had created a video. I had edited a video of the removal, the so-called removal of Town Girls Beneath, is what I called. The actual piece was called Town Girls Atop a Hill, and the piece that became the recording of the painting over of Town Girls Atop the Hill became Town Girls Beneath. And this was how it was presented at YYZ Gallery. And so what was interesting here was how, this piece is being projected onto the wall, and it's, it's edited in a way whereby you're seeing them from afar and up close and, at different angles. But at certain times it feels like they're actually in the space. They're actually painting over, sanding down the wall. This is work that could have been done in that actual space as well, right? I added these pieces to possibly talk about the process of the transfer, as well as just an idea of some of the larger pieces that I've been doing. This is a work called Hiking Black Creek, and this photograph, this image comes from a photograph of my parents when they first came to Canada. My mother came here in '67, and then she sent for my dad, who got here in '70. So when I heard about when I was told about theme of this exhibition, which was to, in addition to other things, to counter preconceived notions of Blackness within Canada, I thought about this photograph specifically, as I always used to, as a photograph that did not show this typical newcomer picture, right? There were these two people who were separated for 3 years and ended up being reacquainted in Guyana, and then, you know, trying to get to know this new place where they were going to live the rest of their life. Guyana is mostly the Amazon, and so for me, it's like humorous for, you know, my father to come here. It's like, let's go hiking. You know, so yes, the colors and such that I added. So what I do first with some of these pieces, I would create a wash on the surface, and then I would transfer over the wash. And I was trying to equate the colors to that time frame of the 70s, so this washed out orange and yellow. And the first time it was shown was at the ROM, whereby, you know, the wall that it was shown against was like this olive green color. Yeah, so these pieces are, each of the panels is 11 feet tall. Oh, and this area is called Black Creek, which is kind of a forgotten area in northwest Toronto. And so I think that's the place too. There's a lot of immigrant families that live in that area, and so I think that, yeah, that region is kind of significant to the work as well. This is called Blur, and it was shown at Georgia Sherman Projects in 2017. And this was the first time I had, created a work on a wall where the intention was to use space and to talk about institutional spaces and who belongs in that space. And this is and also another Blur piece that's right now up at the AGO. This piece is also significant, not for, you know, the use of space, but also the person who I chose to create. I chose as the model for this piece. Her name is Tuku Matthews, and her mother is Salome Bay, who is a well-known jazz musician in Canada. Her father was Howard Matthews, who was the owner, a co-owner of the Underground Railroad, which was a restaurant in Toronto on King Street. So he and his friends, they started that restaurant. It's not around anymore though. He had passed away a few years ago. Tuku is a performer, a singer, and her sister is Saida Babatuliba, and they used to be part of a band called Black Sam, which is a band that was during the 90s, who I really loved because they had this kind of sound, this gritty sound that I used to consider like a Toronto sound. And the music itself had like this fusion of like soul and rock and blues. And so it kind of, for me, you know, being a young person in Toronto during that time, it was, you know, it kind of, you know, it reflected, you know, my experience in Toronto during that time, and the makeup and the fabric of the streets of Toronto during that time. These are just some close-up shots of the transfers. And I landed here because I wanted to read an excerpt, if there's time. Yeah, okay, I just want to make sure. So this is just an excerpt from my thesis exhibition. Again, it's called A Trace Existence of Time Past. We stood along the busy shoreline. After some negotiating, making deals for how much and for how many, we climbed into a small blue and white speedboat. We were about to travel along the Essequibo River. I was disobeying my mother. "Don't go into that speedboat," she said, waving her finger at me as I headed to Pearson Airport for Georgetown, Guyana, with my Aunt Joy. My aunt was taking the trip to reunite with a friend and with home. Like most of her siblings, she hadn't been back for many years and invited me to join her. A last-minute decision, without hesitation, I booked my flight for a back home that I had only experienced through family stories. After a trip to the Essequibo River, after a trip to the Essequibo years ago, my mom returned with stories of feeling unsteady and unsafe in the boat. I understood. We were all tilted back in the tiny vessel. Mom probably felt that at any point, at any time, there may be a bump or a sharp, unexpected turn that would cause her to topple over into the river. She did not want to consider the possibility of me falling in either. The water was so close to us, and of all the things to reflect on, I remembered that piranhas lived below. Don't put your hand in. That urge to caress the rapids as our boat bounded quickly across the surface had to be suppressed. Piranhas lived in that water. Don't put your hand in. Keep your hands inside the boat. All my life I heard stories of encounters with killer piranhas. I just rolled my eyes. The boat pulsated up and down as it sped through. The wind blew past and through us. We hung tight as the rapids grew stronger. The river is immense, and at times it was hard to take in and absorb while teetering and tottering and struggling to steady myself. It was so loud that we were yelling at each other in order to be heard over the roar of the engine and the crash of the waves, both at the same pitch. I peered up and allowed my eyes to follow the flock of birds swirling together, forming an elegant S again and again. Eventually, we calmed as the river calmed, and finally sat in silence to experience the beauty and quiet of the Essequibo. The color of the water has been described as café au lait. The water is stained by the tannins from the leaves that fall from the surrounding trees, the vegetation, the rocks, and other naturally occurring elements, sediments that travel from shore to the depths of the river. So much happens below the surface. As we floated in silence, our guide pointed towards a line in the river. He explained that the line divided two directions of flow. Each flow had a slightly different shade of brown. We traveled along one, then crossed over to the other. Moving from one place to the next place, we eventually traveled in the same direction as the water beneath us. This time, not as quickly, tiny laps of waves hit our sides, then quieted as we fell in line, like the piranhas swimming alongside, waiting to nibble on my fingertips, and the birds flying in tandem above. We all moved from one place to the next place, together. Similar to the move of a family, my parents, aunts, and uncles, younger than I am now, they left home and transplanted themselves into a new place, as part of a generation of folk from the Caribbean who picked up and moved on to experience another life, an adventure that may have at times felt like a rush through rough waters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for sharing that excerpt with us as well as talking about your practice.
Thank you.
I'm going to hand the floor over to Eunice. Please give a round of applause for Eunice.
I'm sorry you had to read this statement because I'm absolutely not going to do that anymore. But I'm going
that
to
was
explain
my
why.
performative. No. Not you.
Yes, please. So I had a very
Switch chairs. Okay.
I had a very hard time deciding how I was going to prepare this talk because at first I wanted to be able to have us all together make a curatorial statement, but I actually never had the time to do that work on my own. So I didn't want to be doing that with you because it would be a waste of time for all of us. Then the more the time passed, the more I was aware of how this presentation was going to go. I think I just fell out of the loop by many other talks that I had given in the past months. The CUJAH conference was actually the first speaking engagement I said yes to, but it was the last one that I was doing. So I just felt like I was never really prepared for this one, and then I just kept bumping into people yesterday telling me, "Oh, girl, you're talking with Sandra Brewster," and then the pressure just started going on. And I was not prepared to share a space with you today, I have to say, so I'm really happy. But I'm also very shy about this. So I just did not know what I was going to do with this talk anymore. So one of the things that I really wanted to get back seriously into for this year was to go over my curatorial tips, because I haven't done that in a very long time, but that's still something that I want to nourish and keep doing. When I created the curatorial tips in 2015, I was going through a severe bout of racism and oppression at work, and considering I wanted to leave my job, I started thinking about how I could work as an independent curator. And I also, while thinking about this, I noticed that although I do have a specific degree in curating, I have a graduate diploma in curatorial practice from York. There was no tangible actions or tasks or operating instructions that I could follow in order to make myself a full-time curator. So I have a list of new tips that I do want to add, but I, again, did not have the time to do it. So for this presentation, I will look at the previous curatorial tips that I have done and see how and if I was able to work through them or not during the period in which I was not able to create more tips. So the public presentation will still require active participation, so I'm expecting you to be doing the work with me today. And at the end of each of the tips that I will be revisiting, I will also ask you questions related to them to see how we can contribute to keeping those tips relevant and up to date. So the first tip that I wrote was about being creative. I remember where I was when I wrote this tip. It was a Sunday during the winter. I was in my bed and I was feeling very low about work and about Quebec systemic racism. And I was really getting frustrated, sad, and angry, and just completely lethargic. I was noticing that because of those feelings, my brain did not feel like being creative or sharing my creativity because of the way that I was feeling, which now I realize that was white supremacy just working effectively on my body, being oppressed to a point where even my thinking process and mental computation was not working. I wrote this tip as a form of mantra, as a way for me not to get sucked in a pit of despair. So this tip reads, curators were part of the wonderful club of creatives. By curating exhibitions and research projects, what do we do? Create, create, create. So put creativity in all your life, your style, your books, your apartment. So I can say that since the last time I published the whole curatorial tip series, I have been doing that tip very well. I curated the exhibition Over My Black Body last year at Galerie de Lucan. I'm currently moving in my new apartment and I know it will look fabulous. And I have been dressing so well in the last months that it feels like a crime to let people see me like this. Yes. I also remember that when I was studying at the undergrad and graduate level, I felt like the only time I could be creative was in finding a topic for a research paper. I kept telling myself that although I was studying art, the school system was not making it easy to use creativity as an outlet for writing. So research papers could never be poetic, or you could never really insert some creative writings in there. Yet at the end of the day, I do have a BFA. So the questions that I'm opening the floor with now is, what are your creative outlets as students at the moment? And how are you being creative inside and outside of school?
So, does anyone want to start? If not, I'll pick on my friends.
So thank you. Merci. Yeah. I'm also an artist, and
Do you want to introduce yourself?
yeah,
Olivia?
sorry, excuse me, everyone. I'm not an art history student, but I do work through art history processes and learning, and so this is a very good tip.
Yay.
Thank you. I suppose we're in Concordia, as everyone said. So research creation is something that I'm practicing, and I guess maybe it's something you're interested in, and that seems to be the biggest creative challenge in my particular predicament at this moment. And I'm sure it's not maybe shared with everyone, but this helps me figure this out.
Nice.
And so the idea of like making and thinking about the making all the time is a headspin that I wish to know one, but also is the best headspin because it forces you to think through, I guess, the stuff that you're referring to, the creative action of putting these ideas together, of putting these different images together, and that kind of makes it a more interesting thing. But it's really challenging.
Yeah, it is.
So I can say that.
Anyone?
I used to go to Concordia. I don't go any, well, I graduated and I live in Halifax. But I was living rurally for like 5 years after finishing my MA here, but I was also an artist, but while I was here, I wasn't really, I was focusing on art history and trying to contextualize how does my work work within like an art historical context, or learning about more artists that I feel like I share, some common themes with and everything. So after like graduating from here in Montreal, I moved to rural Nova Scotia, where it was extremely isolating. So I felt like the first year, like getting back into art making was all happened within like the property I was living in. So within my domestic space, I just tried to feel like I knew even cooking and just spending time cooking was artistic. So I was just finding all these different ways that were creative outlets and just like journaling. And I still kind of practice that now, even though now that I live in Halifax. And so I just feel like there's just ways that I just incorporate it into my everyday life. And I just by doing that, and I just felt like the domestic space in my neighborhood is all kind of source material for work. So I always kind of incorporate some photos from my everyday life into my work, because I just felt like also as a child, it just feels like being domestic and being within that space has always, and this idea of home has always been a part of me since I was a child. So there's just some way that I have to just incorporate it into my practice. So yeah.
Okay, that is really exciting, all of what you said, because one of the things that kept me busy and stopped me from doing this was everything else that happens in life. And now I notice that one of the things that I just really now integrate in my curatorial practice is actually gardening and relationship with soil and plants. And so I totally get you, and it was really because of the space I was in and the means that I had and what I could do at the time. So it's nice that you are still able to integrate that in what you're doing. So you live more in the city setting?
Yeah, now I do, yeah,
okay,
exactly.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Just to bounce on that, I think also the way sometimes we see creativity is something really productive and active, but at some point you feel really creative even if you're in a really bored situation, no? And a moment of nothing happened, and then you're in your imagination and you go, and then there's a flow or something that makes you really, really creative, even if there's nothing done with that or not done at this moment.
Yes. Nice, okay, thanks. Okay, so far this is going great. Okay, so so the second thing I want to go back to is the curatorial tip number 2. So when my brain is going well, and I have enough mental strength to brush off microaggression and oppression, I have many ideas of exhibitions I want to create. I'm able to make a list of artists I'm interested in working with, ideas of themes that I want to explore. And when I wrote this post, I came across, that was also in 2015, I came across a call for a curatorial proposal that seemed like a great opportunity. It was in New York, so it meant that I could escape from the misery I was going through at the time. And it would also just be a fresh start for me. And the theme of the proposal was just directly linked to a subject I was interested in researching, which I don't remember now. I knew I had the strongest of artists and a strong idea. However, when I saw the deadline for that project, the deadline was at midnight on the day that I found the call. So I sat in front of my computer and just tried to get all of those ideas together, because obviously I had them, but I just wasn't able to start the writing process. And at some point I just gave up the writing, and I was really feeling frustrated, and I really felt like it was my fault. I mean, I had the resources, I had all of it, but I just didn't put my ideas together. So that's when I wrote this one, which reads: curators, whenever you have an idea, write it, conceptualize it, believe in it, verbalize it. Don't wait for deadlines. The earlier you start, the more you'll have to form. You'll have a formed idea. Once it is time to put it out in the world, you will have a well thought out, well formulated project. So I just kept telling myself, I should have written everything somewhere. I should have jotted down notes. I should have had a notebook. I should do this. I should do that. So in order for other curators not to go down the same road, I wrote that thing. I still do not have a notebook, and my office desk is filled with flyers and post-its thrown in a pile of things to pay attention to or keep for later. And now that I'm moving, it's just a dreadful pile of things to go through. However, I do write things down, I do follow my own advice, and I do keep things to write exhibition proposals. So there was a call recently for the Sight and Sound Festival organized by Eastern Bloc, and I had a wonderful idea, but I just didn't have the time to write it. But I did write it even after the deadline, so now I know that I will be able to propose that project somewhere else because it is that good. So the question that I'm asking you now is, when you have research ideas for school papers, journal submissions, or any other things, are you able to apply this tip? And in what ways are you conceptualizing your ideas and making sure you're keeping them somewhere? Well, they become your friends.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that this is a very poignant point because I'm someone who waits a lot for deadlines to generate my ideas and creativity. But I'm wondering if anyone else has not that experience and if they would like to share, or if they also have that experience and how they keep track of their ideas. Is it on your notes, on your phone? Austin,
yeah.
Please feel free to share.
I use a notes app, but the thing is with the notes app, I try to have it all in the same window, but they ended up just being spread out, and so I have to find them. But the great thing is Control F for search. We love that function. And I think in terms of actually writing things, for example, this past weekend there was a call for an artist run center, and the deadline was at midnight that night, and kind of the same thing happened. And I was oh no! But that deadline inspired me to again add to that note and to jot it down for a future opportunity.
Yeah.
And I'm writing my thesis right now in the MA program, and earlier on in the writing process of my first draft, I would be it's not going to come to me, and I'll wait it out, or I'll make a note of something, and then I was just it's not going to come to you if you don't start. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So I ended up just, sometimes it feels like word vomit, but it actually ends up being most of the time productive though. Whatever comes out is at least better than nothing, and I think that's a step in the right direction. So that's for me.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Maybe Ashley, would you like to also tell us a bit about how you sort of collect your ideas so that they're still there the next day?
I am still, I think I'm from the time where everybody wrote things down. So for me, there's this direct connection. I'm looking at things. It's more than just photos are great, but when I think back months later, it's really those initial observations that I kind of jotted down. I don't do it always. I'm human, but when I do that, I find that it's really, and I think what Eunice, you were saying about kind of sticking to an idea that resonated with you. I think trusting your intuition, this might not be the right moment to proceed with this, but I think there's something here, and holding on to it, I think, is really important. That's what I would share.
Nice, thanks. But I really enjoy the word vomit part because actually it's just how it goes. Otherwise, if you're waiting for the perfect sentence, then you're just never going to write anything, which is the issue with this.
I think that's your tip number 3. Is just to write it right now.
Absolutely, yes. So, how long do I have? I have 20 more minutes?
Well, I mean, that's including
okay.
Okay, so however long or short you like.
Good. I only have another tip, but, will you see? Okay, so I just want to go back to the menu again. No, the page where it is. Thanks. Yes, you give it a miss. So that is one of my most recent tip. I think I wrote it in 2018. I wrote this one in response, specifically to in response to the cultural appropriation discussion that was happening at the time. people, companies, and creative, culturally appropriate, hide behind the excuse of respecting other people's lives and stories, wanting to make customs and practices accessible to the public. So I was wondering, is talking, presenting, and discoursing on racialized and indigenous people really a sign of respect? So this tip reads, speak your truth. Curating, as much as writing, comes from a personal perspective. When curating an exhibition or finding inspiration for it, it is important to speak your truth in order to find the best possible thread between the artworks you have selected, but especially in understanding why a specific work is touching you to the point of including it in an exhibition. The best and strongest stories told come from the heart, and curating can be the same. So I believe that when you speak your own truth, you're able to present sincere projects, but I also think that BIPOC artists are capable of doing that work on their own. They don't need the help that they supposedly need for that. And I was also wondering if, for instance, you're not a Black Canadian, what truths do you have in using Black Canadian culture in your work? Say, how can you think that this is appropriate for your public to understand the perspective of those people if you are not really genuine in the understanding of that issue yourself? So for this tip, the question that I have, I'm not even sure I have a question, but just to make the exercise, I'm asking, what are instances in which you saw blatant cultural appropriation in art and or curating? And how can you be an accomplice to cultural appropriation? So if I may start to answer that question, when I did the exhibition Over My Black Body last year, one of my main issues was that when we approached the artists for the exhibition, we told them the specific theme was to understand how the Black body was commodified in society and how people would perceive it through the media. But I really told them that, this is the topic that I'm thinking of. I just want you to take it and do whatever you want with it. So you don't have to make, a painting of someone appropriating someone else, or I'm not looking for specific work. I just want you to respond to the theme in, however way you want it to translate. So, but I really had an issue when I gave the proposal at first, because it just reads as if I need something from them and they need to answer a specific question about something that they probably don't want to talk about anyway. And one of the things that I was also really interested in is that when we talk about Blackness, it's never a conversation in between Black people, for instance. It's always someone recounting a story of something they've heard, or a friend of a friend, or whatever. But if I speak about being Haitian with other Haitians, we just talk about, what our parents said, the punishments we had, those kind of things. So that's one of the things that I was really interested in bringing out from the artist. And at the end, when we did have the exhibition, there was no presentation of Black violence or murder or things like that. And people that were not Black were almost angry at us for not being honest about the truth happening, So that was one of the things that I was really curious about. So I'd like to know how, I'll repeat my question. What are instances in which you saw blatant cultural appropriation in art and curating, and how do you think you can be an accomplice to cultural appropriation? Yes.
Well, I remember this time when I was at the CUJAH in Cape Town, so the newly opened big modern and contemporary art museum. And there was the work of this artist who's a white Zimbabwean man who was representing maize, millies. You don't say millies in Canada. Corn, yeah. And he spoke a lot about how it was a staple food back home in Zimbabwe, blah blah blah. And I remember that it felt very wrong to me, because I thought, well, obviously you and your family probably could afford imported food in the context of Zimbabwe, and you probably didn't have to grow maize in your backyard to survive. So that was for me, an example where I thought I did not respond in the best way because I didn't bring up the issue with the artist himself afterwards. I just kept that at the back of my mind, and as you were speaking, this memory came back.
Yeah, that's a great example, because most of the time it's always someone who has grown near it or has been around it, you know, but they sometimes don't understand the privilege that they have in talking about it in the way in which they do. So this is a perfect example. I think one last example.
And there's obviously quite a few. But I forget the artist's name. She was a painter. It was 3 years ago at the Whitney, and she painted the
Emmett Till's casket.
Thank you.
Yes.
So that I think the response, the work itself is obviously a blatant cultural appropriation, and I think the most interesting aspect of that instance was the response to it and the sort of like protests that were oriented around it. I think some artists would like to perhaps convey some sort of allyship in making work such as that, right? Like, look, I painted this image of this black boy who was killed. But it's really just about asking yourself, like, is this my lived experience? If no, don't do it. In my undergrad and doing my BFA, I was doing this still life of, I'm going off, like, this is another thing, but I was doing a still life of a few objects that we were told to, like, have some importance to us. So it was like a stuffed animal I had as a kid, and then this Louis Armstrong record because I used to play trumpet, and he was like my hero. And so I like did this Louis Armstrong record, and my teacher at the time was like, some people might see this as cultural appropriation because I'm using this black face and I'm a white artist. And that was something, I was 19 at the time, I hadn't considered that at all. Of course, obviously not my intention to do so, but it's about going out of my own intention as an artist, because of course artists, curators were not always there in the space when the work was presented, so the viewers can think whatever they want and attach whatever intention they think the work has, whether it be positive or negative or somewhere in between. So those are the things that I learned that I want to put forward. And yeah, I think that's a good blurry answer, but
No, that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
yeah, of course.
I have an answer.
Yay!
I'm just thinking about this time that we're in of agenda filling, right? A lot of these institutions, they feel that they must show certain artists because it's like check marking the boxes that are essential right now. And there have been times when, I've received opportunities, so-called opportunities to exhibit, like in the States and such, but you can tell by the wording that really the institution has no idea what they mean when they talk about diversity or blackness even, or they'll say things like otherness, so they use these words that are supposed to be the words that will get you going and make you feel that that they are aligning with the content or the context in which you're working. But you can tell, and also who they are, it's very evident that they have no idea, right? And they're just doing it for those agenda-driven reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we also have in Canada, the amount of people who want to talk about Indigenous artists and invite Indigenous artists in spaces where they don't want them to be present. And so because, the Canada Council is giving funding, that now everybody wants to do it, so we definitely still have that conversation.
But you bring up a good point too about the councils as well, because at times people are applying for grants that will fit that bill, regardless of who they are. It could be even a black person applying for a grant for a black show, whatever. But they're trying to, at times, they are trying to fit in with what you were speaking about before as trauma and like what it means to be this hard-run black person. When we should be able to own our stories. And that whole idea of when I talk about, it was only recently that I started talking about my practice as centering blackness. But when I say that, it means that our stories. It could be stories about anything. Stories about, the Essequibo River and movement. Stories about, when I show my blur work, it's about this feeling of, you know, having an identity that's a combination of, you know, the past, the present, and the future. You know, these stories that affect who you are presently and how you will continue to live. But it's not necessarily in response to a white gaze, and many times it is not meant for the white gaze.
Yes.
And you know, I'm just working, and I am very aware that there is this white gaze that, you know, can conflate blackness,
Yes.
right, and can kind of demean the intentions. And I've experienced that with, you know, a few interpretations of things. I've had to ask people, you know, but through whose gaze are you looking at? Because from what you're saying, I'm not with whatever your perception of what I'm doing is. Anyway, yeah.
Cool, thanks. So that's it for me. I'm hoping that this, you know, inspired you and this helped you think through things. And it definitely helped me, you know, work through things. So I just feel like I should go back and, you know, give more tips because I think I'm pretty good at it. And it's really useful. So, yes. So thank you.